You can tell what kind of man someone is by the way he treats people who look powerless. The words barely left Elijah Carter's mouth before Richard Whitmore smiled across the marble lobby like he had just heard a joke worth $1 million. Rain pressed softly against the 40-foot glass windows of Whitmore National Bank while customers in tailored coats stood beneath warm chandelier light, pretending not to stare at the black man near the front desk. Elijah's charcoal jacket looked worn at the sleeves. His shoes carried traces of dried city rainwater. In a place where wealth announced itself through Rolex watches and Italian leather briefcases, he looked invisible until the moment he handed over the check. Richard took it between two fingers with visible disgust, leaning back slightly in his custom navy suit as if the paper itself carried dirt. "That's a very large number for somebody like you," he said loud enough for nearby customers to hear. A few nervous chuckles drifted through the lobby before disappearing into the quiet hum of air conditioning and keyboard clicks. Elijah remained calm. His dark eyes moved slowly across the polished room, past the gold logo on the wall, past the security guard watching him near the entrance, then back to Richard. "I'm only here to verify the funds," he said softly. Richard glanced down at the check again, then laughed under his breath. "You people always come in here with stories." The words settled heavily into the room. A young teller stopped typing. An older man near the investment offices lowered his newspaper. Even the security guard shifted uncomfortably beside the glass doors. Elijah never raised his voice. "Sir," he replied, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Richard stepped closer across the counter until the scent of expensive cologne mixed with the smell of fresh coffee from the customer lounge. "No," he said coldly. "The misunderstanding is you thinking this bank hands out respect for free." Then, without warning, Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out a polished gold lighter. The tiny flame flickered blue for a second before turning bright orange beneath the edge of the check. Gasps spread instantly across the lobby. Elijah watched silently as fire curled along the corner of the paper, ash drifting slowly toward the marble floor beneath them. Richard held the burning edge just long enough for everyone to see before dropping the damaged check into a silver tray beside the counter. Smoke twisted upward between them. "Men like you," Richard said quietly, adjusting his cufflinks, "don't walk in here carrying checks worth $40 million. The entire bank fell silent except for the rain tapping softly against the giant glass windows while Elijah Carter stared at the burning paper without blinking. The smell of burned paper lingered in the air long after the tiny flame disappeared. Nobody inside the lobby seemed comfortable enough to move. Elijah Carter slowly reached toward the silver tray and lifted the damaged check between calm fingers, brushing a line of black ash onto the polished marble counter. Richard Whitmore watched him with the same cold expression a man might use while waiting for rain to stop. Around them, expensive shoes shifted quietly across the floor. Somebody near the investment offices cleared his throat, but no one dared interrupt the silence hanging beneath the gold chandeliers. Elijah folded the check carefully and slipped it back into the inside pocket of his worn charcoal coat. His movements carried no anger. That was the part beginning to unsettle people. Most customers expected shouting. They expected humiliation to turn into chaos. Instead, the black man standing in the center of the bank looked almost tired, as though this moment belonged to a lifetime he had already survived years ago. Rain rolled slowly down the giant glass windows behind him while he glanced toward the front entrance for a brief second. Outside, taxis splashed through wet Manhattan streets beneath glowing traffic lights. The city looked cold tonight. Elijah remembered another rainy evening almost 30 years earlier, standing beneath that same building as a boy while his mother held his hand tightly beside the revolving doors. Back then, Whitmore National Bank had smaller windows and darker walls, but the feeling inside had been exactly the same. His mother wore a grocery store uniform that smelled faintly of cardboard boxes and soap powder after 12-hour shifts. She had come hoping for a small business loan to keep their tiny beauty salon alive in Brooklyn. Elijah still remembered how nervous she looked sitting across from a loan officer who never once looked directly into her eyes. He remembered the silence during the drive home afterward. He remembered her crying quietly in their apartment kitchen while pretending to wash dishes. That was the first time Elijah understood what humiliation sounded like when adults tried to hide it from children. The security guard near the entrance adjusted his jacket and stepped closer now, waiting for Richard to give another order. Richard straightened his silver tie clip and glanced around the room with visible confidence, enjoying the attention from customers pretending not to stare. To him, Elijah was already finished. Another poor man who wandered somewhere he did not belong. But Elijah had spent decades learning the value of silence. After graduating from community college, he worked night shifts cleaning office buildings while studying finance textbooks from public libraries. He built his first investment portfolio from $500 saved over 3 years. He slept in tiny apartments. Ate instant noodles. Took buses across boroughs in winter snow because he could not afford taxis. Nobody handed him power. He built it slowly where nobody could see. And standing there now beneath the warm gold lighting of the bank lobby, Elijah looked less like a billionaire than a man carrying memories too heavy for expensive clothes to erase. Richard Whitmore had spent 22 years turning Whitmore National Bank into a cathedral of intimidation. Every inch of the building reflected the kind of power he worshipped. The marble floors were imported from Italy. The bronze elevator doors had been polished so perfectly they reflected the ceiling lights like still water. Even the air inside the lobby smelled expensive, carrying traces of roasted coffee beans, leather briefcases, and the faint chemical scent of fresh money. Richard believed appearances mattered. Because appearances kept people in their place. He walked through the bank every morning at exactly 7:15 wearing tailored suits worth more than most families paid in monthly rent. Employees straightened their backs when they heard his shoes crossing the marble. Assistants lowered their voices when he passed. Young bankers studied the way he adjusted his cufflinks during meetings because they thought confidence could be copied like handwriting. Richard enjoyed that. Control was the only thing that ever made him feel secure. His father had built the bank from a small regional lending company into one of the most powerful financial institutions on the East Coast, and Richard inherited not just the business but the belief that wealth separated valuable people from everyone else. In his world, money was proof of intelligence. Poverty was evidence of failure. And men who looked like Elijah Carter were problems waiting to happen. Richard glanced around the silent lobby now and noticed customers still staring toward the black man near the counter. He hated disorder inside his bank. He hated uncertainty even more. So he decided to crush the moment before it spread beyond his control. "You are making my clients uncomfortable," he said sharply. Elijah remained still beside the marble counter, one hand resting inside his coat pocket near the damaged check. "I only came to complete a transaction," Elijah answered calmly. Richard smiled without warmth. A transaction requires credibility. Near the reception desk, a young employee lowered her eyes toward her computer screen, pretending not to listen. Another banker quietly stepped into an office and closed the glass door halfway, careful not to become involved. Nobody inside Whitmore National Bank challenged Richard Whitmore publicly. They all knew what happened to employees who embarrassed him. Careers disappeared quietly. Promotions vanished. Office doors stopped opening. Richard moved closer until only the polished counter separated him from Elijah. "People spend their whole lives earning the right to walk into this building," he said. "You think showing up with a stolen piece of paper changes that?" A few. Customers nodded subtly, eager to align themselves with power before truth had a chance to arrive. Elijah looked at the giant gold logo hanging behind Richard's head. Whitmore National Bank. The same name that once made his mother cry quietly in a tiny Brooklyn kitchen. The same institution that denied loans to families from neighborhoods banks rarely invested in unless they could take something away. Yet Elijah's face showed no bitterness. That calmness irritated Richard more than anger ever could. Angry people were easy to remove. Calm people forced others to think. Outside, thunder rolled softly over Manhattan while rainwater streamed down the giant windows in silver lines. The security guard near the entrance took another cautious step forward. Richard adjusted the sleeve of his suit jacket and gave a small nod toward the guard without taking his eyes off Elijah. The message was clear. In Richard Whitmore's world, power did not ask twice. The security guard started forward carefully, polished shoes gliding across the marble floor while nervous whispers spread through the lobby like smoke. Elijah Carter did not move. His hand remained inside the pocket of his charcoal coat, fingers resting lightly against the burned edge of the check while rainwater shimmered down the towering glass walls behind him. Richard Whitmore watched with growing irritation. He had expected fear by now. Most people folded the moment authority raised its voice. Most people apologized when power humiliated them publicly. But Elijah stood with the quiet stillness of someone who no longer measured his worth by another man's opinion. "Sir," the security guard said cautiously, "I am going to need you to step outside." Elijah looked toward him politely. "I understand you are doing your job." His calm tone only deepened the tension crawling through the bank. Near the teller stations, a young Latina employee named Sofia Ramirez glanced again toward the damaged check resting partly visible inside Elijah's coat pocket. She had worked at Whitmore National Bank for less than 11 months, long enough to recognize the formatting of corporate financial instruments and private institutional accounts. Something about the routing numbers printed across the bottom of that check made her stomach tighten. Richard noticed her hesitation immediately. "Sophia," he said sharply without taking his eyes off Elijah, "return to your station." "Yes, sir," she answered quietly, though her eyes lingered on the check another second too long. Richard stepped closer to Elijah again, lowering his voice into something colder. "This bank serves people who earn their place here." Elijah's expression never changed. "And who decides that?" Richard smiled faintly. "Life usually does." A few customers nearby nodded subtly while pretending to scroll through their phones. Nobody wanted to challenge the man who controlled billion-dollar accounts from the 42nd floor. Richard enjoyed that silence. To him, silence meant agreement. He adjusted the sleeve of his navy suit and glanced briefly toward the giant gold clock hanging above the lobby entrance. Every second this scene continued made him feel less in control of his own building. That feeling angered him more than Elijah's presence ever could. "You should leave before this becomes embarrassing," Richard said. Elijah finally removed his hand from his coat pocket and carefully placed the damaged check flat against the marble counter. Burned black edges curled slightly beneath the warm chandelier light. "It already became embarrassing," Elijah replied softly. The words landed harder than shouting. Sophia looked down immediately to hide her reaction. One of the younger bankers near the elevators shifted uncomfortably beside a leather briefcase. Even the security guard seemed unsure whether he was protecting the bank or protecting Richard's pride. Rain thundered harder against the glass outside while distant lightning flashed silver across the Manhattan skyline. Richard's jaw tightened. "You think standing here calmly makes you intelligent?" Elijah looked directly into his eyes for the first time since entering the bank. "No, sir," he answered quietly. "I think character reveals itself when people believe there are no consequences." The lobby fell completely silent again. Somewhere near the private offices, a coffee cup touched a saucer with a faint porcelain click. Sophia swallowed nervously before glancing once more at the numbers printed across the surviving section of the check. Her fingers hovered above her keyboard. Richard noticed the movement instantly. "Do not waste company time verifying fraudulent paper," he snapped. But Sophia hesitated. Because for the first time since the confrontation began, she was no longer afraid of being wrong. She was afraid Richard Whitmore might be. The tension inside Whitmore National Bank thickened until even the sound of rain against the glass walls seemed distant. Nobody in the lobby returned to their conversations anymore. Phones remained frozen halfway above designer handbags and expensive wool coats while customers quietly watched the confrontation unfolding beneath the chandelier light. Elijah Carter stood beside the marble counter with calm eyes and relaxed shoulders, looking more composed than anyone else in the building. Richard Whitmore hated that. Control inside his bank was supposed to belong to him alone. Instead, every second Elijah remained standing there without fear, chipped away at the image Richard had built over decades. "I will say this one final time," Richard said coldly. "Leave my bank." Elijah looked down briefly at the burned check resting near his hand before meeting Richard's stare again. "A bank should belong to the people who trust it," he answered softly. "Not the people who misuse it." The words spread through the lobby like a sudden draft of cold air. Richard's expression hardened instantly. "Security," he snapped without looking away from Elijah, "escort him outside now." The guard hesitated for half a second before stepping closer again. But even he looked uncertain now. Elijah had not threatened anyone. Had not shouted. Had not even raised his voice once. Near the teller stations, Sofia Ramirez quietly reached toward her keyboard while pretending to organize paperwork. Her pulse hammered inside her chest. The surviving numbers on the damaged check still burned in her memory. She knew enough about institutional banking to recognize accounts connected to private executive holdings. Richard noticed her movement again. "Sophia," he warned sharply, "do not test my patience tonight." She froze immediately, fingers hovering over the keys. Around them, whispers moved carefully through the crowd. A middle-aged woman near the entrance lowered her phone slightly after secretly recording part of the confrontation. Two young investment associates exchanged nervous glances beside the elevators. One elderly customer slowly removed his glasses, staring at Richard with visible disappointment. For the first time in years, the atmosphere inside Whitmore National Bank no longer felt polished. It felt exposed. Richard sensed it too. That frightened him more than he wanted to admit. "People like you always believe money buys respect," Richard said loudly, making sure the room heard every word. Elijah's face remained calm beneath the warm golden light reflecting across the marble floors. "No, sir," he replied quietly. "Respect reveals character." Silence swallowed the lobby completely. Even the security guards stopped moving. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled through the city skyline while rainwater streamed down the 40-foot windows in silver waves. Richard suddenly felt every pair of eyes in the building watching him instead of Elijah. That realization struck his pride like ice water. He straightened his jacket aggressively and stepped closer to the counter. "You walk in here dressed like that carrying impossible checks, and you expect us to treat you like a serious man?" Elijah glanced slowly around the luxurious bank lobby. A serious man does not need strangers to feel small in order to feel important. Several employees lowered their eyes instantly. Sophia swallowed hard. Richard's face reddened beneath the polished chandelier light. The room had shifted without anyone noticing. Moments earlier, Elijah had looked powerless standing alone inside a bank owned by wealthy white executives. But now Richard looked like the smaller man despite controlling the building around him. The rain outside intensified again, tapping hard against the giant windows while Elijah stood completely still beside the burned remains of $40 million and a room full of people beginning to realize they may have judged the wrong man. Rain continued sliding down the giant glass walls of Whitmore National Bank in slow silver streams while silence settled heavier across the lobby. Nobody moved now unless absolutely necessary. The tension no longer felt like a public argument. It felt like the final seconds before something irreversible. Elijah Carter stood quietly beside the marble counter, one hand resting near the burned check while warm chandelier light reflected softly across his dark skin and weathered charcoal coat. Richard Whitmore remained across from him, jaw tight, shoulders rigid, trying to hold together the authority that had begun slipping through the room like water through cracked stone. Near the teller stations, Sofia Ramirez lowered her eyes toward her computer screen again. Her heartbeat pulsed loudly inside her ears. She knew she should stop. Richard Whitmore controlled careers inside this building the same way wealthy men controlled elevators and boardrooms and invitations to important dinners. People who embarrassed him disappeared quietly from the company. But the numbers on Elijah's check refused to leave her mind. Institutional routing codes. Executive authorization formatting. Private reserve markings almost nobody outside upper banking divisions recognized. Her fingers trembled slightly above the keyboard before finally pressing the first key. The sound was almost invisible beneath the rain. Richard did not notice immediately. He remained focused on Elijah, trying to recover control through intimidation alone. "This is exactly what is wrong with the world now," Richard said loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "People arrive with nothing and demand respect they never earned." Elijah looked toward the rain beyond the giant windows. "Sometimes people spend so much time measuring others," he said softly, "they forget to measure themselves." The words drifted slowly through the lobby. Nobody responded. Somewhere near the elevators, a young banker quietly lowered his phone after recording part of the confrontation. An elderly woman near the entrance removed her gloves carefully without taking her eyes off Richard. The atmosphere inside the bank had changed completely. Wealth no longer looked impressive beneath the chandeliers. It looked fragile. Sophia typed the remaining visible account numbers from the burned check into the verification system as discreetly as possible. Her stomach tightened harder with every second. The screen processed the request longer than normal. Then suddenly the system froze for half a breath before a dark blue authorization window appeared across her monitor. Her face lost color instantly. She blinked once. Then twice. The words remained there glowing beneath the fluorescent teller lights. Majority shareholder access. Sophia's breath caught quietly in her throat. She stared at the name attached to the account while cold fear spread through her chest. Elijah Carter. Her fingers slowly pulled away from the keyboard. Around her, the bank still sounded muted beneath the storm outside. Rain tapped steadily against the 40-foot windows. Coffee machines hummed softly near the customer lounge. A distant elevator bell echoed from somewhere upstairs. But inside Sophia's mind, everything had gone silent. Richard finally noticed the expression on her face. "What is it now?" he snapped impatiently. Sophia looked up toward him but could not speak immediately. Elijah remained completely still beside the marble counter, calm eyes reflecting the soft golden light above them. He looked less like a man trapped inside humiliation and more like someone waiting for truth to arrive on its own schedule. Richard stepped toward Sophia's station with visible irritation. "I asked you a question." Sophia swallowed hard. Her voice barely rose above the sound of rain. "Sir," she whispered carefully, "I think you need to see this yourself." Richard Whitmore stared at Sophia Ramirez for a long moment, annoyed more than concerned. The young teller looked pale beneath the fluorescent lights of her station, fingers slowly retreating from the keyboard as though she had touched something dangerous. Rain continued sliding down the giant windows surrounding the lobby while distant thunder rolled softly over Manhattan. Richard walked toward her with sharp impatient steps, polished shoes. Striking the marble floor hard enough for the sound to echo through the silent bank. Customers moved slightly aside to let him pass. Nobody spoke anymore. Elijah Carter remained standing near the counter where the burned check still rested beneath the chandelier light, calm eyes following Richard without fear or satisfaction. He looked almost saddened by what was coming next. Richard reached Sophia's station and lowered his voice. "What exactly is so important?" Sophia swallowed before turning the monitor slightly toward him. "Sir," she whispered carefully, "the account verification cleared." Richard barely glanced at the screen at first. Then his eyes returned sharply to the authorization window glowing blue against the dark banking software. His expression changed almost immediately. Not dramatically. Just enough for the confidence in his face to crack for half a second. He leaned closer. The words remained there unmoving beneath the fluorescent light. Majority shareholder access. Executive priority classification. Internal ownership tier 1. Richard blinked once. Then again slower. His eyes moved downward toward the account holder name attached beneath the authorization codes. Elijah Carter. A strange silence entered his chest. The kind that arrives when certainty suddenly disappears. That is impossible, he muttered quietly. Sophia shook her head faintly. I verified it twice. Richard grabbed the edge of the counter harder than he realized. He began reading the information again. The hidden ownership structure. The controlling investment trust. Emergency liquidity transfers made over the last 3 years. Then the final detail struck him like cold water. Elijah Carter was not simply a shareholder. He was the single largest private owner connected to Whitmore National Bank. Richard slowly turned toward the lobby. The warm chandelier light suddenly felt too bright against his skin. Customers still stood silently watching. Employees remained frozen behind their stations. Even the security guard near the entrance had stopped pretending to intervene. And in the middle of all that silence stood Elijah Carter wearing the same worn charcoal coat Richard had judged. Less than 30 minutes earlier. Richard's throat tightened. His mind raced backward through every word he had spoken. Every insult. Every public humiliation. Every assumption made because of skin color, clothing, and old prejudice disguised as professional instinct. Elijah did not smile. That somehow made the moment worse. Richard noticed the burned edge of the $40 million check resting quietly on the marble counter. Ash still marked part of the surface where the flame had touched it earlier. His gold lighter remained nearby beside the silver tray. Suddenly it looked small and childish beneath the massive bank logo hanging behind them. Richard opened his mouth to speak but no words arrived immediately. Around the lobby, people were beginning to understand. A young investment associate slowly lowered his phone. An older customer removed his glasses completely. Sophia stared down at her desk, unable to watch Richard directly anymore. The balance of power inside Whitmore National Bank had shifted so completely it almost felt physical. Elijah finally stepped forward one pace. Nothing aggressive. Nothing triumphant. Just calm. Now you understand why I asked for verification instead of permission, he said softly. Richard felt heat rise into his face. The man he had treated like an intruder did not merely belong inside the bank. In many ways, the bank belonged to him. Outside, the rain finally began slowing against the glass while deep evening light spread quietly across the Manhattan skyline. Richard Whitmore stood motionless beside Sofia Ramirez's station while the reality of the screen settled heavily into his chest. The glowing authorization codes reflected faintly across his face beneath the fluorescent lights, stripping away the confidence that had controlled the lobby only minutes earlier. Around him, employees avoided eye contact. Customers who once stood comfortably behind him now watched in complete silence. The atmosphere inside Whitmore National Bank no longer belonged to authority or wealth. It belonged to truth. Richard slowly turned back toward Elijah Carter. For the first time since the confrontation began, he truly looked at the man standing across the marble floor. Not the worn charcoal coat. Not the weathered shoes. Not the color of his skin. He saw the calm posture of someone who had carried humiliation before and survived it without becoming cruel himself. Elijah remained beside the counter, one hand resting lightly near the burned check while rainwater continued sliding slowly down the giant windows behind him. The storm outside had softened into a quiet steady rhythm. Richard opened his mouth once before speaking, but the words failed him. His gold lighter still rested beside the silver tray near the counter, small and embarrassing now beneath the towering bank logo hanging above the lobby. He glanced briefly toward it, then away again. "Mr. Carter," he finally said, voice lower than before. "I was not aware," Elijah interrupted gently. "No," he replied softly. "You were aware of exactly what you believed." The words landed harder than anger could have. Richard looked down for a moment, unable to argue. Somewhere near the entrance, the security guard quietly stepped backward and returned to his position beside the revolving doors. Nobody inside the bank moved much anymore. It felt almost disrespectful to interrupt the silence. Richard cleared his throat carefully. "I owe you an apology." Elijah studied him for several seconds without speaking. There was no satisfaction in his eyes. No revenge. That somehow made the shame worse. "Do you know what my mother told me after this bank denied her loan?" Elijah asked quietly. Richard said nothing. Rain tapped softly against the glass while warm chandelier light reflected across the marble floor between them. "She said bitterness is expensive," Elijah continued. "She said if hatred enters your heart, eventually it owns more of you than your dreams do." Sophia lowered her eyes, listening silently behind her station. Several employees nearby stood completely still. Elijah slowly picked up the burned check from the counter, brushing loose ash gently onto the marble surface. "I spent years wanting to prove people wrong," he said. "Then one day I realized successful people do not grow by humiliating others." Richard's shoulders sank slightly beneath his tailored navy suit. The powerful bank manager who controlled boardrooms and million-dollar negotiations suddenly looked older beneath the golden light. "I judged you unfairly," he admitted quietly. Elijah folded the damaged check carefully before slipping it back into his coat pocket. "You judged me before you even heard my name." The silence that followed felt deep enough to echo. Richard glanced around the lobby and noticed employees pretending not to stare at him now. For the first time in decades, he understood what public humiliation actually felt like. But Elijah did not use the moment to destroy him. He simply stood there with quiet dignity, offering something Richard had never expected from a man he insulted so openly. "Mercy. This institution still matters to thousands of families," Elijah said softly. "I did not invest in this bank to watch people lose faith in it." Richard looked at him carefully, struggling to understand how someone treated with such disrespect could still protect the very place that wounded him. Elijah adjusted the sleeve of his worn coat and glanced once toward the rain fading outside the windows. "Power reveals character," he said quietly. "But kindness reveals strength." The rain had almost stopped by the time Elijah Carter turned toward the entrance of Whitmore National Bank. Soft evening light drifted through the giant glass windows now, washing the marble lobby in quiet gold instead of cold gray. Nobody tried to stop him as he walked slowly across the polished floor. Employees stood motionless behind their stations. Customers who once stared at him with suspicion now stepped aside respectfully without saying a word. The atmosphere inside the building felt completely different, as though the walls themselves understood something they had forgotten years ago. Richard Whitmore remained near Sofia Ramirez's station, staring downward at the glowing authorization screen that had shattered his certainty in less than 30 seconds. The powerful executive who once controlled every inch of the lobby with confidence now looked strangely small beneath the chandeliers hanging overhead. His navy suit still fit perfectly. His silver tie clip still reflected the warm light. But none of it carried authority anymore. Pride had left the room before Elijah ever reached the doors. Elijah paused briefly near the marble counter where the confrontation had begun. His eyes settled on the small black ashes still scattered beside the silver tray. Without speaking, he reached down and brushed the burned remains gently into his palm. The movement was slow and careful, almost respectful. Richard finally lifted his eyes toward him. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly, voice rough with shame, "I hope one day you can forgive me." Elijah looked at the ashes resting in his hand for a moment before answering. "Forgiveness is not the difficult part," he replied softly. "The difficult part is changing after the apology." The words settled deeply into the silent lobby. Sophia lowered her eyes again, holding back emotion she did not fully understand. Near the elevators, one of the younger bankers quietly removed the video recording from his phone without posting it online. Even the security guard near the revolving doors stood straighter now, no longer seeing Elijah as a threat but as a man who carried dignity without needing to announce it. Elijah slipped the ashes into his coat pocket beside the damaged check and adjusted the sleeve of his worn charcoal jacket. The coat still looked old beneath the golden light. But now everyone understood the difference between looking powerful and being powerful. Richard stepped forward slightly, hesitation visible in every movement. The board should know what happened tonight, he admitted quietly. Elijah studied him for a long second. Maybe they should, he answered. But public humiliation does not heal institutions. Accountability does. Richard lowered his head. For the first time in decades, nobody inside Whitmore National Bank envied his position. Outside, the city streets glistened beneath fresh rain while taxis rolled slowly through reflections of red traffic lights and office windows. Elijah walked toward the revolving doors without another word. The lobby remained completely silent except for the soft sound of his shoes crossing marble. When he reached the entrance, he paused briefly and glanced back through the warm golden light filling the building. Richard Whitmore still stood frozen near the teller stations, surrounded by wealth, polished stone, and expensive silence that suddenly meant nothing. Elijah gave a small respectful nod towards Sophia before stepping outside into the cool Manhattan evening. Fresh air drifted through the doorway as the revolving glass doors turned slowly behind him. Then the doors closed softly. The sound barely echoed at all. But inside Whitmore National Bank, nobody moved for a very long time.